Chapter 24. The Christians and the Roman Power. Decius, Gallus, Valerian, Gallienus, Claudius, Aurelian. The partial and local persecutions of the earliest times had been succeeded by trials more extensive and severe in the time of Marcus Aurelius, and now came the third phase of the Roman persecutions, universal, systematic, ruthless, and, in their design, exterminating. It began soon after the elevation of Decius to the imperial throne in the year 249 AD. Decius is described as a man of an earnest old Roman nature, who was ambitious to become a second Trajan, and who believed that it was only by the maintenance of the old religion and the destruction of its enemies that the glory of the empire could be restored and established on a solid and durable basis. Had he lived a century later, someone has said, this patriotic sovereign would have shown no less energy for the maintenance of the Christian faith and extirpation of paganism. The year 250 AD is assigned as the date of the fatal edict, an edict so terrible that many believed the predicted time had now arrived when, if it were possible, the very elect would fall. By this edict it was required that the test of sacrificing to the gods should be applied to all persons suspected of being Christians. A time was fixed within which the Christians should appear before the magistrates and take part in the religious rites of the state. Of those who did fall away, it was noticed that some denied their faith with trembling and visible struggles, and others with a light, cheerful air, proving how very thin was the layer of earth on the rock where the seed had fallen. The property of fugitives was confiscated, and the penalty of death awaited them on their return. Among the faithful who suffered death are Fabianus, Bishop of Rome, Babylas, Bishop of Antioch, and Paeonius, a presbyter of Smyrna. But it was not only great cities that were reached by the destroyer. His ravages extended to the remotest villages, and, according to Eusebius, there was not a road or alley where a Christian could walk by day or by night without imminent risk of being challenged to curse his master, and, on his refusal, of being delivered up to death. We read, too, of many being detained in prison, and some of them dying there of starvation. The object in not inflicting immediately the legal penalty of death was doubtless to bring the captives to a recantation, and, on the other hand, barbarous threats and tortures, and on the other, tempting promises and blandishments were resorted to for this purpose. Origen was kept in prison for a time. Cyprian fled from Carthage and returned on the death of Decius, but his martyrdom was postponed only for 7 years. What must originally have been simply a poetic dress for the vast revolution which took place in the course of 200 years from the time of Decius came to be received by many as literal truth. I mean the legend of the 7 sleepers. When many were fleeing to mountains and deserts, 7 brothers took refuge in a cave near Ephesus, but were shut up by the heathen. Here they fell asleep, and continued to sleep until the time of the younger Theodosius, 447 AD. On awaking, they supposed they had slept only a few hours. They felt hungry, and one of their number was sent into the city to buy food. All was changed. Christian churches had been erected where once heathen temples had stood. The people were all strange, and they gazed on him with wonder. The astonishment was increased when the bishop, with a great multitude, repaired to the cave and beheld the rest of the brothers. And then the 7 sank into the arms of sleep's brother, as poets, ancient and modern, have called him. The suffering appears to have been nowhere so great as in Alexandria, where, before the promulgation of the edict, the people had been excited by a certain soothsayer to vindicate the honour of their ancient gods. Men and women, it is said, were dragged forth from their houses and subjected to all kinds of indignities, till the whole city had the appearance of a place taken by storm. The populace being in such a temper, the publication of the edict caused the greatest dismay among the Christians. On this point, and in confirmation of certain particulars mentioned above, I may quote the language of Dionysius, Bishop of Alexandria, which has been preserved by Eusebius. Book 6, chapter 41. All were in the utmost alarm. Many of the most prominent in the church went immediately of their own account to the judge. Others were summoned and led off from their homes. Others again were constrained to go by their kinsmen and friends. Called by name, they approached the unclean and unholy sacrifices, some pale and trembling, as if they were not to present, but were themselves to be presented as the victims of idols, so that they were laughed to scorn by the multitude who surrounded them, as men too cowardly to die, who still showed their cowardice in the performance of pagan rites. Others ran up willingly to the altars, and declared with much boldness that they had never been Christians. Some endured torture for a while, and then accepted deliverance by abjuring the faith. But the firm and blessed pillars of the Lord, supported by his strength, proved themselves admirable witnesses of his kingdom. Decius perished in a battle against the Goths, 251 AD. His body was lost in a morass and was never found. Under his successor, Gallus, the calamities of the empire rendered it difficult to carry through the plan of persecution, though now also there were not wanting martyrs, among whom the Roman bishops Cornelius and Lucius are particularly named, as having been first banished and afterwards executed. About this period a terrible plague broke out and spread far and wide, and there is too good reason for ascribing its virulence in great part to the carnage caused by the edict of Decius, which had tainted the atmosphere. Few of the great cities of the empire were spared. At Rome itself, the deaths are said to have amounted at one time to 5,000 a day. At Alexandria, where the Christians had been so mercilessly slaughtered, the tremendous fury of the pestilence caused such desolation that, according to the testimony of Dionysius, there were fewer inhabitants of all ages than there had been previously above the age of 40. But how did the Christians act, both here and in other great cities? When the heathen fled in horror from the contagion and abandoned their friends and relations in the hope of saving their own lives, those who for generations had been stigmatized as haters of mankind forgot their bitter wrongs and sufferings and were unwearied in their care of the infected and the dying. In this way, says Dionysius, the best of the brethren departed this life. We may be assured that such self-devotion was as highly appreciated and did as much for the spread of Christianity as the heroic devotion of those who were burned, or beheaded, or cast to the lion, though this had made so profound an impression that even judges and executioners were led to profess the faith which once they sought to destroy. On the other hand, it must be admitted that there were still many who persisted in ascribing drought, famine, plague, defeat, every calamity, in short, to those who refused to sacrifice to the gods. Valerian, however, who succeeded Hostilianus in 253 AD and reigned until 260 AD, showed himself disposed to strengthen his government by conciliating the Christians, and is said by Eusebius to have had several of them in his palace. But under the influence of his favourite, Macrianus, and in consequence of thickening disasters, which made him superstitious and led him to have recourse to Egyptian soothsayers, he issued an edict in 257 AD requiring that all the assemblies of the Christians should be closed, and that the bishops should be banished if they refused to offer homage to the gods. This was followed in 258 AD by a more stringent one, to the effect that bishops, presbyters, and deacons should forthwith be executed, that senators and knights should lose their dignity and their goods, and should, if they persisted in the profession of Christianity, be punished with death. Ladies of rank should, after confiscation of their goods, be banished. Christians at the imperial court should be treated as slaves and employed in servile labour at the various imperial estates. The most celebrated victim of this persecution was Cyprian of Carthage, but it would seem that the first sufferers were the Roman bishop Sixtus II and 4 of his deacons, among whom was Laurentius. There is no reason for questioning the martyrdom of the last mentioned, but whether the legend that is associated with his name has a foundation in fact, it is impossible to decide. The Roman magistrate had heard of the treasures of the church, and was desirous of obtaining possession of them. Laurentius was ordered to bring them, and, showing a readiness to comply, was let go for the purpose. He returned with a train of the poor and maimed. "These are our treasures," said he, and for this insolence, as it was considered, he was set on a hot iron chair and finally put to death. After dwelling on the severe and systematic persecution of Decius and the interruptions in the execution of his sanguinary projects which so soon followed, it may occur to you that the question which ought to be put is not why the persecution under Decius was extensive and systematic, but why, under the emperors generally, it had been so fitful, and why it had been interrupted for periods so long that the normal condition of the Christians, though of course from the state of the law they were never absolutely secure from violence and death, was one of tranquillity. The question is answered only in a very partial way by discriminating between emperors who were of Roman origin and anxious to restore the old Roman virtue, and men like the Syrians Heliogabalus and Alexander Severus, and Arabian Philip, or like the Roman Commodus, in whom there was nothing of the true Roman spirit. I have seen it remarked by a French author that persecution is not usually pushed with vigour where there is not a body of priests deeply interested in the maintenance of the established worship. They nourish the distrust and hatred borne by the multitude toward religious innovations, and, besieging the avenues of the throne, will not suffer the prince to forget what they consider the most sacred of duties. Now, of course, the priests of the empire were interested, like some other classes, in putting down Christianity, but not to such a degree as to engross their thoughts and energies. The ancient sacerdotal corporations were either destroyed or greatly weakened. The office of Pontifex Maximus was one among the many magistracies with which the emperor was invested, and as to the other priests, they were mostly old consuls, old aediles, and even old generals, and they neither were united into an organized body nor derived any emoluments or privileges of importance from their position. Hence, in part, the intervals during which the church rooted and grew, and hence also in part the cruel violence which was resorted to when persecution was rekindled. Valerian, having been taken captive in his unhappy war against the Persians, was succeeded by his son Gallienus, 260 to 268 AD. The new emperor issued an edict of toleration, by which, after long suffering and tribulation, the Christian Church was for the first time recognized as a legally existing corporation in the empire. He not only forbade further oppression and persecution of the Christians, but gave orders that the buildings and churches of which they had been robbed should be restored to them. After Gallienus had subdued Magrianus, who had appeared as his rival in the east, claiming the imperial dignity, the edict came into force throughout the whole Roman world. During this period, when the Christians, as such, had not reason to complain, the empire was in an unhappy and perilous condition, disastrous invasions by the Persians, Goths, and other foreign tribes being aggravated by famine and pestilence. Gallienus died before Milan, whither he had been called by civil war, and was succeeded, 268 AD, by Claudius, who, during his 2 years' reign, acted towards the Christians in the spirit shown by his predecessor. Aurelian, however, who became prime ruler in 270 AD, although he left them unmolested during the greater part of his reign, issued an edict, or, for the accounts are conflicting, formed the resolution to issue an edict of persecution. But, whether he actually issued it or not, his murder prevented its execution. During these years of rest, the condition of the church had become more externally prosperous than at any former period. Large and beautiful churches were built, among which is particularly to be noted one in Nicomedia, the imperial residence. Christians attained to high military posts and to considerable offices at court, where they were treated by the new emperor Diocletian, 284 to 305, as children of the house. This growth and development continued during the greater part of his reign, till 303 AD.